Thank you very much, and good morning again. I've had tremendously exciting conversations over the last day or so, and as per the introduction, currently I work with the UNDP within a unit or an agency called the SDG Impact Finance Initiative, and what we're trying to do is explore how we can engage commercial capital, private sector business through the modality of impact investing with a view to helping to support the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, I want to talk about this concept, a term I've been using called the Internet of Impact. And the term came about in a moment of total frustration. I was doing work with the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the World Economic Forum, and we were talking about data standardization for impact investing, which is in itself a very boring topic. And I was asked, well, why are we really trying to do this? What are we trying to achieve? And I thought, well, in that moment of frustration, well, we're trying to create this Internet of Impact, the way to communicate our progress in achieving both financial outcomes and performance, but also non-financial. And now, today, with the terminology of the Sustainable Development Goals, we can exchange impact for Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to start with a quote by the chief executive, the new chief executive of Nestlé. And just after the General Assembly meeting at the UN in New York, there was an article in the Financial Times talking about the UN engaging business, trying to talk with business, and talking business. And in that, this was said, which is that there is a risk of free rider issues, and basically that we have some very loose goals and effectively a lot of enthusiastic and hot money trying to chase those goals, and we need to address that. So one of the big questions I'm asking with colleagues at the UN and others is, how do we recognize legitimate progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals or the achievement of impact? Because so often we can tell a story and it has a different interpretation depending on who we are. And a lot of that is because the data are not yet comparable. We'll exchange units and metrics, think it means something, and somebody else will interpret it in a different way. And we really just have a deluge of different types of impact reports, and most of them are very glossy and very colorful, but there's not very much consistency. And again, to reinforce this point, that really impact is a perception that is in the eye of the beholder, and we really need to address that. So, as many of you are aware, and we've had some of the discussions today already, introductions, there are any number of standards out there, metrics, certifications, etc. And within that, yes, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, again, another framework and another attempt at a common language. But yet all of these somehow still operate in silos, and we don't necessarily have full interoperability or harmonization between all of that. And that fragmentation ultimately creates waste. It's very cumbersome and laborious and expensive for everyone to then analyze and often go over territory which others have already gone. And it reminded me of how the internet came about. And before we had the World Wide Web, we had computers connected to each other, and they were wired together, but if they weren't the same type of computer or the same type of system, it was very difficult to communicate. And then, in 1989, we had the introduction of the World Wide Web, and suddenly we had a very, very different experience. And suddenly, all those different platforms and domains could talk with each other. And really, at the heart of it, it was this idea of a standardized data structure for storing and sharing information. There was a common language that was introduced. Just like now, we have the introduction of the SDGs as a common language for expressing impact and non-financial goals and objectives. And initially, I started talking about seeking data that is readable by both machines and people, with the emphasis on being machine readable, because if we have a PDF document or a paper document, it's very difficult to feed that into machines and then aggregate and disaggregate those data. But increasingly, I'm also starting to realize that it's important to maintain, particularly with the introduction of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and often very obscure computer languages, we need to also maintain the ability as people to read this information, particularly as we're talking today about ethics and value, and helping us as people to understand the decision-making that is often made by machines. I'd like to use the analogy of the Web 2.0, which is the internet as we know it in our pockets and our smartphones, which is very much a diverse and rich ecosystem, but very importantly, it's all about user-generated content. It's no longer just a single channel of information being piped to us, but we actually co-create this internet. It's a live experience that we all exist in, and to some degree, there I think is the parallel with the impact story, because we're all telling parts of that story, and somehow together the full picture is really an accumulation of all of those different components. There's also a very important balance in the internet, which is on the one hand it's a public good, it's an open good, and there's it's a platform for commercial interests and commercial business as well. And somehow in what we're trying to do with opening up our data architectures and how we communicate and organize our impact data, I think initially people are sometimes very concerned, well, what are we sharing here? These are maybe proprietary data or proprietary structures, but if we just allow ourselves to think that, yes, if we co-create the open platform, the open architecture as a foundation, we can then build proprietary models and commercial models on top of that. And yes, nowadays we also have APIs and other very interesting ways of organizing data architectures in a peer-to-peer way. For those of you who don't necessarily tweet very often, I use this example to explain how commercial organizations are voluntarily, openly sharing their data architectures with each other with a view to actually promoting their own interest, and it becomes, that support of that public good becomes a good business decision. So here is an example of me tweeting the article by the Financial Times, a commercial organization, via Twitter, another commercial organization, and it happens largely seamlessly. So together with these organizations, many of whom I've mentioned, we are trying to explore how can we improve the way we experience and communicate impact. And we're trying to see, well, can we use this metaphor of the Internet of Impact to help? And there are two components that I want to emphasize, and I've touched on them already. The one is, first of all, creating a data commons of data, rigorous academic, scientific knowledge, often also anecdotal information, but the core data, the source data. And secondly, on top of that, a secondary layer of how do we interpret those data based on our personalized and personal perspective. And maybe to give you a few examples, we start off with a few principles, and I think it's very clear in those conversations that I'm having with colleagues and others that there's a requirement for sharing, an acceptance that we're co-creating this experience. There's an acknowledgement that we need common standards and frameworks and norms. And we also need to look at the technology, because a lot of the time there's reporting fatigue, and we need to look at how we can harness the new technologies that are out there, the computational power, artificial intelligence. We spoke yesterday a little bit about blockchain as one example of those technologies. And just like the internet is experienced in a different way, depending on whether you're looking at it through a smartphone or a smartwatch or a big full desktop, you get a very different experience depending on your perspective. Or for those of you who would like a more traditional example of looking at the world and the universe, again, depending on your perspective, your sense of scale and detail, you see a very, very different picture. So somewhere in that, I noticed there were a few things that triggered ideas. And I'll touch on a little bit of detail. The slides will be online afterwards, and you can read the detail in time. In terms of the data side, I again see two different components. On the one hand, there's the conventional data, the intentionally generated data, as I mentioned, the academically rigorous research, the anecdotal data, practitioner reports, and so forth. But there's also this other very exciting part of the data universe, and that is the data exhaust that we leave behind, whether it's the mobile phone records from the calls we make, whether it's our banking records, whether it's things like shipping data or air traffic and social media. And we can talk in detail maybe afterwards about how we're using those insights to inform ourselves at the UN. But very importantly, there's some sort of requirement for context-relevant interpretation of those data. In other words, how do we authenticate and validate those claims of impact? A bit like if you're handed a banknote, how do you check that this is not a forgery? We need some sort of sense of trust, and in doing so, maybe with all of these data, we're starting to explore, well, what sort of governance models do we need, and what sort of oversight do we need in terms of these data around impact? And the mobile phone industry has GSMA, the internet has W3C, and there are others out there that effectively help us authenticate these issues and these standards. So we're looking at working on creating the right arrangement to do this. And I want to come back to why we're doing this, because I think most people have seen this number, depending on the context or the emphasis. It ranges between 1 trillion or 5 trillion a year. That is the funding gap to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. The absolute number is really, I think, less important. It's the order of magnitude. It's the fact that this is not going to be achieved through expanding, extending a business-as-usual model. So we need to radically rethink how we do this. Of course, this is forced the UN and others to engage in a conversation of how do we draw in business and commercial finance and capital markets, because that is the scale of the funding requires that engagement, and it really does need a step change in thinking. And to emphasize the quote and maybe paraphrase it, there is now, I think, a risk of hot money and sloppy metrics causing a risk of free riders. And we really need to look at how we signal legitimate progress towards the SDGs, and to some degree, how the UN and others, and collectively as a society, how we can be the guardians of the Sustainable Development Goals. So a few of us are exploring an idea, and I present this as a question, as an introduction, to see, is this the sort of right idea that we could and should collectively be exploring? And I suppose if I was the Secretary General of the UN and I was getting my regular briefings, weekly or monthly or quarterly, I would want to have 3 questions answered. In other words, to know whether we're closing the gap on the SDGs. And the first is something around the capital supply. We heard early on today about different types of money being appropriate for different types of activity. And certainly when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we know that some of them are more easily financed in a traditional commercial way, and others will probably need some degree of subsidy, either full subsidy or partial subsidy. And we need to understand the mix, and we need to understand and also identify whether we have the right amount and type of money ready to be able to be deployed for the SDGs. The second is, are we matching that capital supply with the right kind of capital demand? In other words, the UNDP, in which I work, has a very large pipeline of programs and projects, but not all of them are investable, and we know that. So the next challenge is to work out how many of those can we convert into investable projects, and also then identify other companies and initiatives that are investable, because if we don't have the right balance, the match between the capital supply and the capital demand, we'll continue having conversations where investors say we simply can't find the deals, and people who are desperately to do good things say we simply can't find the money. And the third question is perhaps the one that links both of those, and the emphasis of my talk today, which is how do we recognize legitimate progress? Are we actually on track? So often we hear people claiming alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of it is loose alignment, some of it is on the back of very, very hard work. And some of it is just a rebadging of a business-as-usual approach. And if we're not clear about how much progress we're making, and particularly closing that gap, we'll get to 2030 and still have that gap. So on that note, I'm going to draw the discussion to a close. And I thank you very much for your time, and I'd love to hear your reactions and comments and questions in the breaks afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Because we are